welcome to the first of this academic year's Mansfield Public Talks. For those who don't know me, I'm Helen Mountfield. I'm the principal here, and it's wonderful to see so many people. I'm delighted in particular to welcome you because this today is our second Jocelyn Burnell lecture in science in honour of our professorial fellow, Dame Jocelyn Burnell, Professor Burnell, and she's here, I'm very pleased to say. The reason we have a public lecture named for Jocelyn is because she discovered pulsars, the dead remnants of massive stars, which you get after a supernova explosion, when she was a graduate student at Cambridge. And the significance of that discovery was recognised by the award of the 1974 Nobel Prize in Physics while she was still a graduate student. But despite Jocelyn being the person who discovered pulsars, which she's talked about in one of these talks, the prize was awarded to her supervisors, Anthony Hewish and Sir Martin Ryle. Jocelyn is the embodiment of modesty, and she defended that decision and said, well, I was just a research student at the time, that's how it works. But I know that we, and I think now the world, feel the injustice of that on her behalf. And we are very happy that since then, Jocelyn has received very many honours, and when I just arrived here in 2018, she got a breakthrough prize for physics from the Fundamental Physics Prize Foundation, and she pledged all that money, and it was a lot of money, to create scholarships for women, minority and refugee students to follow her footsteps and undertake research in physics. And she felt, because I remember her saying that she did that because she felt that she had spotted something different, because she felt so different. And I think it's a really important reason that diversity of thought matters. It's not just about fairness, although it is about fairness. It's about people having ideas that interlink and make you think of things you hadn't thought about before. And it just is so very much an admirable thing about Jocelyn, and something that we hope that we can develop here at Mansfield. Now, in 2021, Jocelyn joined Albert Einstein, Edwin Hubble and Stephen Hawking by becoming a recipient of the prestigious Royal Astronomical Society Gold Medal for Astronomy, and that happened since the last time we had one of these lectures, so we need to congratulate her on that. And she was also one of the small group of women scientists who set up the Athena Swan Charter, which is now used across the globe as a framework for transforming gender equality within higher education and research. So we're delighted that Jocelyn is a professorial fellow here. We're delighted that we are able to honour her in this way. And we hold the Jocelyn Burnell lecture in November because Jocelyn's discovery of pulsars was on the 28th of November 1967. And that's our way of honouring her incredible contribution to science and to encourage that kind of inquiry by everyone now. We owe the presence of Jocelyn at our college to Professor Stephen Blundell, who's here tonight, and his wife, Catherine Blundell, who are a truly dynamic husband and wife team, who are both world-leading scientists and professors at Oxford. And Catherine Blundell is at St John's, where our speaker tonight, Sue Black, is the new president. And so Catherine and Stephen introduced Jocelyn to Mansfield and have been great champions of the establishment of this lecture. So I want to thank the Blundells as well. And in a minute, I'm going to hand over to Steve, who's going to be in conversation with our speaker, Professor Dame Sue Black, and then take questions from you. But I do just want, having said a great deal about Jocelyn, to welcome our speaker this year, Professor Dame Sue Black. It says a lot about the calibre of Jocelyn that because this other great Scottish scientist knows her they've known one another for a very long time, that she was, I think, pleased, and in her first couple of weeks really at Oxford, was prepared to take on another thing and come and give this talk for us. So that's something else that we owe Jocelyn. Sue is the words of the UK's leading forensic anthropologist, and her work has ranged from war crimes investigations to Kosovo to single suspicious deaths in the UK, everything in between. And she's been recognised nationally and internationally for her work in the fields of war crimes investigations, mass fatalities and other casework. And also recent research focusing on the identification of perpetrators of child sexual abuse from indecent images of children. It's very hard work. I am in awe of her for doing it, and she's had a string of awards, which I'm not going to read out, but a lot of awards for this work, and Steve is going to talk to her about it and then take any questions from you. So thank you very much, Sue, for coming tonight. It's a delight to have you here.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Helen. Sue, thank you so much for being with us this evening. The first question I wanted to ask you is, you were described by Helen as a forensic anthropologist. So what is a forensic anthropologist?
So most people say, what's the difference between a forensic anthropologist and a forensic pathologist? And I usually say about 100,000 a year in salary is the difference between the two. So the forensic bit just tells you you're an expert when, I'm sorry if I sound like a tuba, but welcome to Oxford Freshers' Flu, which I got a week ago. So I'm normally about an octave higher, so I do apologize for this. So the forensic bit comes from the Latin word forensis, which means pertaining to the forum, and the forum are the courts of Rome. So fundamentally, anybody who's a forensic anything, it just means that they take their anything into the courtroom. And the anthropology, which is the Greek bit, is the study of the human, or what remains of the human. So when you put the forensic and the anthropology together, our job primarily is to say, who was this individual when they were alive? For us, it's mainly about identification. What a pathologist will do is they will tell you about a cause of death or a manner of death, whereas our job is to say, who was this person when they were alive? Or, if I'm looking at images, is the person who's in the images the suspect that we have in custody? Oh, my hair's in the way. I do. Do you know, I love this necklace, and I knew it was going to be problems from day one as well. So let's take that out of the way, and let's get rid of that, and hopefully we'll be doing fine. Thank you. I'm so sorry.
So, okay, you've told us what a forensic anthropologist is. At some point in your life, you must have decided, I want to be a forensic anthropologist, no?
No, nobody wants to do that for a living, do they? You know, there's no career prospect in school that says, you know, I'm going to be a forensic anything, quite frankly. And it's a wonderful thing when you get to be so old that you can look back on your life and you can look at the path you've taken and you can find those crossroads. And you say, why did I make that decision at that crossroad? And it's only time that often allows you to do that. And so I've been doing a little bit of that of late. And I go far enough back, I think, my father, I was a daddy's girl. I adored my father. Any excuse I had, I was this little shadow. I went everywhere with him, God bless him. And my father was a great shot. And so he would go out shooting rabbits and deer and whatever it would be. It was always for the pot. It was never for sport, never ever. And so from about 4 or 5, I can remember walking back with my dad carrying rabbits or pheasants or whatever it may be. And my mother was a bit squeamish. So my mother was happy to cook them, but she was never happy to do anything else. So I had the excuse of sitting at the back door with my father, and he would teach me how to skin a rabbit or how to grill a deer or pluck a pheasant or whatever. So from about 5 or 6, I was really quite happy having hands covered in blood and having dead animals around me. It just seemed like a normal part of life. And then classic Scottish Presbyterianism, my father said to me when I was 12, what are you going to do for a job? And I thought he meant when I grew up. No, he meant when I was 12. What job are you going to get? Because his rationale was, you have 5 days in school, you have 2 days when you're doing nothing else, and that's the devil's work. So you have to be doing something for those 2 days. So go out and get a job, and whatever job you get, half of your earnings must go to your mother for your board and lodgings. And so at 12, it seemed perfectly logical to get a job in a butcher shop. And so the entirety of my teenage years were in a butcher shop, up to my elbows again in blood and muscle and bone, and feeling quite comfortable about that. All of my friends were working for fashion stores or the makeup counter on Boots or whatever. But, you know, I was up to here in liver and such things, just feeling, you know, it was a perfectly normal thing. And my biology teacher in school, and teachers are so important, but my biology teacher said, when you go to university, and I didn't know I could, because nobody in my family had ever been to university, so I didn't know what that meant. But I worship, there's a sort of repeating history of me worshipping men in my life, and I don't mean that, I really don't. But he was just my favorite teacher. I just adored him, and I still talk to him to this day. And he said, you know, you need to go to university. So I wanted to be a biologist like him. And my first 2 years in university, I had no idea why I was there. I was so bored, and I couldn't see any point to what I was doing. Forgive me for the botanists in the room, but you know, I'd cut so many plant stems in half with a razor blade and never understood the point of why I was doing it. I had Petri dishes full of dead fruit flies, figuring out whether they had rounded bottoms or pointed bottoms, because it had something to do with genetics that I never understood. And by the end of second year, I was really questioning, what am I doing here? And in third year, they gave me the opportunity to go into the anatomy department. And of course, the anatomy department is just a butcher shop with a different animal. And so that Rubicon of crossing into a dissecting room and knowing that the person who's in front of you actually gave their remains solely for the purpose for you to learn, that was a really important moment that I thought, nobody is ever going to give me a gift like that again. This is what the value and the cost of education is about. And so in that dissecting room, what we did was we dissected a human from the top of the head to the bottom of the toe. It took an entire year to do. And I knew I'd come home. That was where I was comfortable. So at that point, I thought, okay, I'm going to be an anatomist. And in anatomy, most of the research projects were doing things like lead levels in rat brain or carcinoma in hamster pituitary. And I have a pathological fear of rodents. So my girls have never had a pet hamster, gerbil, mouse, or anything. In my books, the only good rodent is a dead rodent. And so there was no way I was ever going to pick a dead rat out of a bucket to do anything with it. And so I went to the member of staff and said, what else can I do? And she said, well, why don't you think about looking at human remains and how can you identify people from human remains? And that's where my research project went. When I was in, I think it was about the first year of my PhD, there was a case came into the department, a forensic case. And I'm so old that these were in the days before DNA was being used in a forensic investigation. And this case resulted from an individual who was flying a microlight, and the microlight crashed off the east coast of Scotland, and his body went into the sea. And it was a couple of weeks before a body was washed ashore. And now a couple of weeks in the North Sea, you're not pretty by the time you come in. And there had obviously been some damage to the area around the head. And the means of identification at that time was, could you identify somebody from their face? But the face was just not usable. Because of the salt water, the fingerprints had gone, so you couldn't use that. There had been so much damage to the face, we couldn't use the teeth. And there was no DNA. So the question was, this body that came in, how likely was it to have been the young man who went missing on the microlight? Now, what we could tell is from enough of the soft tissue that it was a male, that it was a young male of the right sort of age, that the height was about right, and the ethnicity was about right. And that's okay, but that just tells you you've got a man between 25 and 30, 5'8" to 5'10" in height and white. That doesn't tell you it's the person. And so you then have to start look at the identifying features. And we identified that he had a birthmark just below his left nipple. So we spoke to his mother, and his mother said, my son had no birthmark, my son was perfect. We thought, oh, now that's difficult. We spoke to his girlfriend, and his girlfriend said, yeah, of course he's got a birthmark underneath his left nipple. So it's really important that when you're asking the question of somebody, that you ask the question of somebody who knows the intimacy. Often your mother is the last person to know what you may be hiding underneath your clothes. You maybe need to speak to somebody more personal. But the importance of that was, whilst the girlfriend, when we released the body, and the Procurator Fiscal was happy that it would be that individual, that the girlfriend accepted it, but the mother never did. She never accepted it was the body of her son. Nowadays, of course, we'd have no problem because we do the DNA test, but at that time we couldn't. And that was a real challenge to say, not only are we, perhaps in some cases, looking at identifying someone for the purposes of the courts, but we're actually trying to convince family that the body we're giving back is the person that they're missing. And sometimes family don't want to know that because they want to be able to keep the hope alive that that person is, perhaps there's still a chance. And of course there wasn't. So sometimes the news we bring back is really hard. So that was a really long answer to say, why did I want to become a forensic anthropologist? I didn't. It just kind of happened that way.
So you found that career path by a circuitous route, but you've clearly thrived in it and been extraordinarily successful. What is it you think makes a good forensic anthropologist?
A huge amount of curiosity. So you never accept anybody's word for anything, which again, I know, I can hear that I've got problems on this as well. It's still not quite working. Don't know. I mean, I'm happy to keep shouting. No, it's still here. Let's try it again, but maybe doing it this way.
Sounds like the battery is gone. I don't know if there's a spare one.
It might be something to do with the sound. Oh, I'm happy to use that if you are. Yep, that's no trouble at all. So, what was the question?
What makes a good forensic?
What makes a good forensic anthropologist? First of all, innate curiosity. So you never believe anything that anybody tells you, because there is always more than one side to any story, and you need to be able to listen to all sides. Your job as you go into the courtroom is to be an impartial scientist. And you can't be an impartial scientist if you're only listening to one side of the story. You have to listen to all sides. So we like to ask a lot of questions. For an anthropologist, I think you need to be an anatomist. There is a lot of training that is done on human skeletal remains, but the skeleton is just a small part of the entirety of the body. So you really need to understand all of the soft tissue as much as you do the hard tissue. You need to have skin that's as thick as a rhino, because if you're going to be a forensic anything, those lovely lawyers that we have in the courtroom, she says, looking at Helen, their job is to make your life difficult. And so you really have to be almost unflappable in difficult circumstances. And you have to have a really strong stomach. So you have to be prepared for what you can't be prepared for. And often in a team, the police who are in that team or the military who are in that team will look to you as the scientist to not be affected by what is going on around you. And you become an anchor in many ways for those teams. So you do have to be very, very carefully grounded in what you do.
I mean, you mentioned there about the relationships you have in your role with other bodies. I mean, one of those is the police. So working as a scientist with the police, how does that work? Do they respect you, or do they...
You'd have to ask them if they respect me. I have never found, and we talk about police and military, not so much these days, but in the past has been quite a misogynistic approach. I've never had that. I have never in any way felt that I have been treated negatively because of a female. In fact, quite the opposite. So if you imagine in Kosovo, we're at a crime scene, and it is in the middle of nowhere. It is not like CSI. If you think CSI is what the reality of it's like, it really isn't. We've no running water. We've got no electricity. There's no security. I mean, it really is quite grim. And, you know, when you're the only woman on the team, these are very obvious things, but you monitor how little you drink, because if water goes in one end of you, it has to come out the other end of you. And whilst it's easier for men, because they will find a tree, it's much more difficult for women. And I found that the men in the team, they recognized that there were some situations that were more challenging for a woman, and they never, ever made you feel uncomfortable. So I thought I was very, very lucky. But that doesn't make you immune to the fact that when you're a part of that team, they're not going to cut you any slack. Absolutely none. So we had a mortuary in Kosovo, which was a disused grain store. And they knew that my fear of rodents was a real fear of rodents. So the military, God bless them, they'd go into the mortuary first thing in the morning, make a load of noise, frighten all the mice and the rats out, and then it would be, you know, in you go, now I've done my bit, get on with it, girl. Or when we were at Podievo Meat Market, one of the techniques that they had was that they would dig a mass grave, the bodies would go in, and they would place something like a horse or a cow on the top. So when you smelt decomposing, the expectation as you dug down was you'd find an animal. And so we were digging in Podievo Meat Market one day, and you're sitting on the bumper of the car, and you could see that they'd hit something. And I went to move forward, and one of the officers, and bear in mind that they're carrying firearms, said, "Stay." And when an officer with a firearm says stay, you genuinely do stay. And what had happened was they'd hit this liquid horse, and it was a rat's nest within the liquid horse. And so, of course, all the rats shot off down the sort of, rat tunnels. And then once they'd gone, he went, "Okay, you can now get into the hole with the liquid horse." So there's no suggesting that as a girl you're going to need any special treatment. But they were also sensitive enough to know that that was my genuine
That was your
fear.
problem, yeah.
But they weren't going to treat you any differently whatsoever. Get in the hole with the liquid horse. And you knew you were going to smell bad for weeks on end when it came to that.
So moving on from the sort of police side, you also mentioned about working with lawyers. I'm a physicist, so I'm used to having a scientific idea I'm working on, questioned by colleagues in the part of scientific debate. But that works within a framework of respect about certain ways of arguing. Inevitably, you get called into a courtroom where there's two sides and it's adversarial, and there might be a side that's hired you or is involved with the Crown, for example, and there's another side that's trying to show that somebody is innocent of whatever crime the Crown is being produced by, and you have the lawyers then interviewing you as an expert witness. Yeah. So that's a very different kind of way of having your science being examined.
And there are good lawyers and there are bad. So I've had some experiences in court where it has been so utterly fair, and you think that those are the good quality lawyers who are there to question you on your evidence, and that's what we're there for, is to have our evidence questioned. And you need to be prepared as a scientist that you are impartial. You might have produced your report at the request of the prosecution or at the defence, but it shouldn't make any difference which side. You're not on sides when you go into the courtroom. You are an impartial scientist. Your evidence should be the same on either side. There are some lawyers where it really is a gladiatorial arena, and it is going to be an arena. And
they want to discredit the witness.
Well, not necessarily to discredit the expert witness. Some will try to do that if they feel that's something that will be beneficial to their case. But their case is about representing their client, and they have to represent their client as best as they think and feel they're able to do. And there are some that will use some tactics and others who simply won't. And so we often find that lawyers will come after us in three ways. So the first one will come in after our evidence, and that's exactly what they should be doing. It's about testing the science, testing the theory. How sure can you be? Are there other options that perhaps you haven't thought about? And where an expert witness makes a mistake often is they feel, I'm a prosecution witness, so my job is to support the prosecution case. No, it's not. That's not your job at all. Your job is to help the jury. And the jury are the most important people in that courtroom because they're the ones who'll decide. And we have to try and explain the evidence to them so that they can make a sound decision. So our evidence is fine. Sometimes, though, they will come after you in terms of processes and procedures. And I've seen a colleague really just brought down in court because the question was, how long did you spend looking down a microscope? To which the answer she gave was, well, I don't know, it was about 10, maybe 12 hours. What do you mean you don't know? Isn't the job of an expert witness to record everything you do? So shouldn't your notes have the point at which you went onto the computer, onto the microscope, and the point at which you came off? So you should be able to tell me to the minute, to the hour, how many hours you spent. If you can't keep that level of notes, what kind of an expert witness are you? And it was just awful to watch. You could see that she didn't have the rebuttal skills that she needed. And so at the end of the day, they decided that she was not a credible witness. And so she literally was taken out of the courtroom on the fact that she hadn't written down how many hours she had spent on a microscope. And if they can't get you on that, they'll come after you personally. And by that I mean they will give their junior lawyers free rein to say, go see what you can find on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on whatever, because we're looking for a way that will give us an inroad. So I've seen a colleague who, they went online and found a lecture that she gave 10 years before. They brought it in and said, 10 years ago you said this, here's the lecture that you gave, goodness knows when. You're now saying something different. So what's happened in between? So sometimes you've no way of knowing what's going to come at you. And I had a truly horrendous moment. Well, it wasn't me that had the horrendous moment, it was my young colleague. And I gave evidence, first of all, and it was fine, because it was after my evidence that they went, and that was absolutely fine. But when they got to him, that they went after him personally. And they said to him, what's your relationship with Professor Black? And he said, well, she's my head of department. They went, oh, no, I think it's more than that, isn't it? And he said, I could feel my face getting redder. And he said, the redder I got, the more guilty I felt about something I'd not done. And he said, well, I don't know, what do you mean? And he said, well, I think it's a bit of a stronger relationship than that, isn't it? And he said, no, it absolutely certainly isn't. But they were just trying to rattle him. And if at any point that there had been something inappropriate happening, which there wasn't, then, you know, he might have said, oh, yes, you're right. You know, we have had a bit of a fling or whatever. And that was just their way to get to him, yes, and to rattle him. Now, often we'll find that judges in court will say, you're expert witnesses, you're big boys and girls, you know, sort it out for yourself. And often they won't step in, whereas they will step in when it's witnesses who are members of the public, for example, because there is a bit more of a protection there. For us, in many ways, we kind of get left to it of our own devices. But I have an arch nemesis in Scotland who is called Donald Finlay, who's now KC. And I love Donald Finlay because you know that when you get on the stand with him, he is going to give you the roughest time you could imagine. And I met up with Donald. He'd cross-examined me for about 4 hours in a particular murder inquiry. And afterwards I said to him, Donald, you were really hard on me in there. He said, aye, he said, I like to get you in court. It's a bit of a challenge. These pathologists are easy, he says. And you think, I don't want to be your challenge. But it is really an alien place at times for a scientist to be.
I think your words are also a great encouragement for any science students who are here about record keeping.
Oh, please,
because
yeah. You are never going to regret keeping too many records, not
yes,
ever. And every photograph, take another 10, because the very photograph you want will be the one that you didn't take.
And timed and dated.
And timed and dated,
yes,
and signed, yep.
Yes. Well, when you're coming to do your work identifying a body, and maybe you've only got bones and maybe not an entire skeleton, what's the bone you most hope to find that's going to be the most important, most informative?
Well, I mean, given a straight choice, I'd rather have a whole body, is the truth, because then there's so much more information that you can get. One of my areas of expertise is in human dismemberment. And so there isn't necessarily a favoured part, but there are different parts of the body that will tell you different things. And so if you're particularly, you know, even if it's just skeletal, and we're looking for evidence, is this masculine or feminine, then I'd quite like to have a bit of pelvis and I'd like to have a bit of skull. If we're looking at, is this a child, then I'd quite like to have a bit of leg. Thank you very much indeed. It just differs. But there's a lovely bone. You know, it is a favoured bone, I have to say, if I'm allowed to have one.
Your desert island bone.
And it's the one that sits just under your collar. So it's your collarbone, your clavicle. And when it was being designed, you know, whoever designs us, and that's up to everybody independently, what fun they had with this bone, because it's a ridiculous shape. First of all, it doesn't do anything functional at all. You can actually remove the clavicle, and providing you stitch the muscles back together again, you don't need it. And in fact, jockeys used to have the clavicles removed, because if you fall off your horse, it's the bone that's most likely to be fractured, and there's some very big blood vessels underneath there, so you want to avoid them if you possibly can. So if you can remove them, so much the better. So you don't really need them, but they're the first bone that starts to form in you as a fetus when you're inside your mum. So just in the first few weeks, within sort of 6 to 8 weeks of you being made, that bone is starting to form. And I think that's a really cool thing to be as the first one. And it forms in the shape that it stays with you for the rest of your life. So ontogenetically, it is fit for purpose, whatever that purpose is, because it doesn't change its shape. And as you're a baby growing, it adds about 1 millimetre a month so that you can age a baby really very accurately from the length of their clavicles, which is why that's the bone quite often that they will look at. They'll look at the femur, but they'll also look at the clavicle. How long is it? Once you're born, that's the bone that survives the best. So wherever we're looking at bones through fire or explosion, I can pretty well guarantee the two areas I'll find will be the collarbone and a bit that's at the base of your skull. That's called the sort of mastoid area. So they survive really well. And they're also the last bone to stop growing. So when the rest of your body has stopped at the end of being a teenager, this bit just in the middle here keeps growing until you're about 25. And that's really useful for us in age estimation. So it's got so much going for it. And I just love the fact that in called the clavicle, it comes from the word clavicula, which is the shape of a Roman key. I just love the idea that you have this key that sits underneath your collarbone. So I kind of like the clavicle. It's a bit of a soft spot for me.
You said you were an expert in dismemberment. You've worked on a number of murder cases. I guess in a lot of murder cases, people are doing it for the first time, and they've got into some shocking situation that they haven't been able to get out of, and they're not professionals at doing it, which means that mistakes are made, and they're probably trying to hide the evidence. So is that's something you've come across?
I mean, most people do not set out to murder someone else. Whatever the television tells us, whatever CSI programs tell us, whatever the novels tell us, most people do not set out to murder somebody else. It usually happens in a moment of passion, whether it is fueled by drugs or it's fueled by alcohol, and you find yourself in a position you've lashed out, and now you have a situation where you have a body. Most people will feel suitably shocked that they will confess at that point. They will phone for an ambulance, they will phone for whatever, and the body will be found. But there are a few individuals who do have that panic of thinking, what do I do? And they may have watched the television, they may have read the books, and it makes it sound as if it's really easy. And it isn't. Human bodies are heavy things, and they're not very cooperative. They've got arms and legs that flop about. And so they tend to also be a little bit wet. So whether we're talking about vomit or we're talking about other parts of body excrescence, they're often not very pleasant to handle. So you're faced with it and you think, what do I do with it? And the question is, I need to get rid of it. And usually what happens is the person who's responsible wants to try and get as much distance between themselves and the body as they possibly can. And they think, where do I put it? You will find bodies that are secreted in houses. You'll find them underneath floorboards, or you'll find them in a cupboard in an attic. It used to be that babies were often found up chimneys, behind bath panels, all of these sorts of places where you can hide a body. But very quickly you realise that bodies are antisocial things, and they start to smell, and smell badly very, very quickly. So you suddenly realise, even though you might have lived with it for a few days, you can't keep on living with it. So now you have to dispose of it. And some people will go in the back of the car. So in the boot of the car, I need to get rid of it. Where will I go? They will often go to somewhere that they know. And of course, it's really difficult to not be caught on an automatic number plate recognition anywhere in the UK at the moment. So people will be able to follow your car. Bodies tend to end up in bodies of water, so that we often find them in rivers, or we find them in lochs, or we find them being washed in ashore, because people think we can just dump them out to sea. So bodies keep returning. They're like boomerangs. You can't really throw them away. They will come back. And some people will think, well, actually, it might be better if I could cut the body into pieces, because it's really heavy and it's really difficult to move a whole body, so I'll put it into pieces. And most bodies will go into 5 pieces. So you have 2 upper limbs, 2 lower limbs, and a trunk. Very bad idea to try to separate the trunk. You do that, it's very messy, it's very smelly, and it's really very unpleasant. So best not to. And there is the question, do most people have, you know, the determination to remove a head? Removing the head is actually really challenging. So it's the head and the trunk, and 2 upper limbs and 2 lower limbs. So you think, well, it must be easy to take a limb off. And most people will go to the kitchen, and in the kitchen you'll find a knife. And so they start cutting, and then suddenly they realize as they're trying to get through an arm, a bone is a really difficult thing to cut through. So you will often see the first place that they have gone to in the dismemberment. You have several of these attempts to cut the body, and they think, this isn't working. What else can I do? This is somebody who's learning on the job. So it's saying, okay, this doesn't work, what else will work? I've got a saw in the shed. And so they'll go and they'll get a saw, and they'll realize that you can't actually cut through skin with a saw because the blade catches up. So they realize, okay, I have to cut the soft tissue first, then I have to try to saw through the bone. Or if it's not sawing, they might use, if they have a blade in the kitchen, for example, you know, one of these meat cleavers, that might be the kind of thing they do. So the first limb they remove is usually a mess, a complete and utter mess, but they've learnt in the first limb how to take it off. So by the second limb, you see it's a much cleaner removal, and so for the third, and so for the fourth. And how many times when you're walking along the street do you see somebody pulling a suitcase? Nobody thinks what's in the suitcase. And so you'll often find that body parts get transported from one place to another inside suitcases. But that dismemberment leaves a tremendous number of clues because it leaves a dreadful mess. So where are people most likely to do it? Well, they're most likely to do it in a bathroom, because in a bathroom you have a piece of furniture that is already the size of a human body. It's called a bath. And so a body fits into a bath rather nicely. It's got a drain, which means that a lot of the fluids go down the drain. And it's got a water source, which means that you can wash it down. So we're going to go to a bathroom first of all. If they've used a cleaver, if they've used a saw, we're going to have the marks on the side of the bath that shows what happened there. And when we go down those drains, we're going to find all of the detritus that you would expect. So there are well-described patterns of what we expect to find. We never expect somebody to be particularly efficient, because most of us have never dismembered and will never dismember. But we did have a case where a gentleman was dismembered. And my colleague and I, we looked at it and we went, this is somebody who knows what they're doing. And of course, the question from the police is, well, who's got that level of expertise? You go, well, a forensic anthropologist could do it. You know, a surgeon could do it, a vet could do it, maybe a nurse could do it, because the body was jointed and had gone through literally the major joints to separate. And what we found out was that there are a certain group of individuals, usually associated with the drug gangs and the major drug gangs, and their job is to be a cutter, and they are trained how to dismember bodies. And so if somebody wants to lose somebody, so you've got a murder victim, you take them round the back of the nightclub, the cutter cuts the body into pieces, the dumper takes the pieces and gets rid of it, and that's the last you see of the individual. I never knew in my life that there was a career opportunity as a cutter for a drug gang, and I suspect they earned more in their process of cutting than we certainly did in our forensic investigation. Yeah.
So when you watch a detective show on the television or read a crime novel, I know you know Val McDermid, but we're in Oxford, so I guess we should talk about Inspector Morse or Lewis or Endeavour. So when you watch one of those shows and they have somebody who will be a forensic pathologist or whatever, working out the time of the body and going, oh yes, their stopwatch has stopped at precisely this time, that's the time of death. So how do you feel when you watch those kind of...
So my husband has banned me from watching them. I'm not allowed because I get so utterly incensed. But I did love watching Morse, and I used to watch Morse with the story. Now I watch and go, oh, that's St. Giles. So I'm so totally Oxford now that I'm looking at what's going on and not really interested and thinking, I wonder which college that's in. I know it's not St. John's, but it's definitely not ours. So I sort of look at it now in an entirely different light. So it's a sort of architectural investigation for me now more than it was. But it's bearing in mind that these things are about entertainment. They're not about education. And, you know, you can't let reality get in the way of a good story. You just can't. Yes. And so for many of these, it's a necessary part of the story that you just stretch the truth a little bit. But I don't watch them. But some of the crime writers, and you mentioned Val, are really very, very focused on getting the experience as realistic as they can, because they respect the reader. And the reader will know when it sounds as if it's not true. And so they want to get as close to it as they possibly can. So Val's a dreadful woman. She's a really good friend of mine. She's a dreadful woman in that she'll phone me up and she'll say, "Oh, what are you working on at the moment?" And you think, she's looking for a story. That's what she's doing. And she will get my research into one of her novels before I've got it into a scientific paper. And you suddenly think, my goodness me, if I end up in courtroom and, you know, I'm being questioned on the fiction of what my science is from a Val McDermid book rather than the reality, that will be a first. But it's never got there. But they really do want to get as close as they can. So for me, it's a busman's holiday that they will send me a chapter and say, does this sound right? What do I need to do differently? Would they say this? Would they do that? And that for me is a bit of fun, but I'd never write something in that genre. Never, no.
I just want to ask you one more thing before I open it up to the audience, because I'm sure there are people here who have questions to ask. But you're dealing in your working life as a forensic anthropologist with some pretty tough things. You've worked in Kosovo, you've worked the aftermath of the tsunami in Indonesia, you've worked with a number of grisly cases, and you're there at the sharp end of life and death, and of course we will all end up one day as a body. What do you think is that unique position that you're in seeing life through that particular lens? What perspective does that give you on life?
I was very lucky. So I grew up on the west coast of Scotland, and my best friend was my grandmother. And my grandmother was a classic Scottish West Coaster who believed in a life beyond this one. And so I used to have the most wonderful conversations with my grandmother as a child. And she believed that death walked alongside you every moment of your waking day. And she believed that if death was your constant companion, you better make a friend out of it, because you don't want to walk every day of your life with an enemy. And she grew up in a little place called Burnell in the 1800s. And she was not allowed to have a man who was a friend. And so death to her was always a woman. So in my family, death was always a she. And somehow that she takes a little bit of sting out of it, takes a little bit of aggression out of it. There's a kindness in death. There's a real compassion in death. And I was honoured to be with my father as he took his last breath, who, as I said, she was the most important person in my life. But my grandmother said to him, when your father dies, because it was her son, when your father dies, you need to be there. He won't want to die on his own. And so he had horrendous dementia towards the end. And he was non-communicative for about a year. And on the night when he was dying, I'd said to him, right, Dad, I'm going home now. I'll be back in the morning. And a man who'd not talked for a year, a fear came across his face that I saw and my oldest daughter saw. And she said to me, you're not going anywhere tonight, Mum. And I said, no, I'm not. I need to be here. My grandmother said, I need to be here with my father. I need to be here with him. And at that 3 o'clock in the morning, that dead of night, the rattle came into his breathing as his lungs filled up with fluid. And I was there with my father as he took his last breath, which for me was the biggest honour of anything that I could ever have been allowed to do. And I've never had a fear of death. My grandmother made sure I never feared death. My father made sure that when that time comes for any of my family, I won't fear the death. I'll respect it, but I don't fear it. And there is, I think, in our society, a change towards death. The Victorians loved a good death. They celebrated a great death. In my parents' generation, Granny, when she died, was laid out in the front room, in the coffin, and everybody came to say goodbye. We've moved away from that. We've medicalised death, and we've removed ourselves from it. And I think we'd be a lot healthier and a lot happier in that acceptance of death. We don't talk about it often enough. But when I see it in my working world, then most of the time they're really sad circumstances. They're aggressive circumstances. And a piece of advice that was given to me by a senior officer was, the only way to cope with this is to say, you didn't cause it. You couldn't have stopped it. Don't own it. Don't own the guilt. It's not yours. Be a scientist. Find the evidence, recover the evidence, analyse the evidence, present the evidence, close the door and go home. that death isn't in your family, it's not yours, it's somebody else's, and you couldn't have stopped it. So don't allow yourself to become personally and emotionally involved. It doesn't mean that we're clinical, but if we have to do our job and families rely on us to do our job impartially, then we need to have that little bit of removal. And it's the same of any clinician. You have to have a little bit of removal of yourself from the situation that's going on around you.
Thank you. Let's see if we have some questions in the room. Anybody who would like to ask? We have a microphone going around. So there's one at the back, I think maybe close to you, Shakriya.
Nothing's out of bounds.
Hello. Hi there, thank you very much. I was wondering what you make of the use of forensic DNA phenotyping, particularly in crime scene investigations and in physical reconstructions, particularly in the light of lots of studies which suggest they've been mobilized for racial profiling in kind of criminal investigations in the US and increasingly in the European Union as well.
So in terms of forensic phenotyping, what they mean by that, for those in the room who might not know, that's being able to take the DNA. It's being able to extract information from the DNA that says, can I rebuild who this person might have been? Can I tell something about their ethnic origin, for example? Can I tell what colour of eyes they might have had? What colour of hair they may have had? Would I be able to reconstruct their face if I knew what the genetics were that were behind the basis of that face? So we have made huge leaps forward in terms of what we understand from DNA. And most of those initial leaps forward came from the world of medical genetics. It was about understanding the human and the variation in the human. What the forensic world does, it's a bit of a magpie in that it goes and finds all the shiny things that everybody else does in science, and then we steal them. And we try to then use them to answer some of the problems that we have. And some of them we can answer quite well. So if we're able to get a full DNA profile, great, we might be able to tell what colour somebody's eyes were. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell you what colour their contact lenses were that they might wear. So it might tell us what colour of hair they would have naturally, but how many people in the room have the natural colour of hair that they perhaps their DNA was telling us about. So we have to do everything with that pinch of salt that says some of the information will be really useful to us, others we have to be very careful. Can we reconstruct a face reliably? I would say not yet, but that doesn't mean that it won't happen. Science fiction has a wonderful habit of turning into science fact because it's something that we can study. And I think it becomes really challenging when we start to look at ancestry, because we live in such an incredibly cosmopolitan world. What does it mean to belong to a particular group in this day and age? Probably very little, because we have so much admixture and we move around the world and we have such a great amount of variation that it probably isn't definitive enough for us to be able to use. So I think it's a great idea. It's something wonderful to play with, but I do think we have to be realistic.
Thank you. Another question.
Go on, anything.
Yes, there's one here.
It doesn't matter how silly you think it is. Everybody else is thinking, oh, I wish I'd asked that.
Thank you so much for this. I was wondering, it seems like in the past, forensic careers were something you chose, and you very much had a decision about, do you want to see, gruesome content in your life or not? And I think now you only have to open Twitter and you see images from Ukraine or any of the catastrophes around the world. And I wonder if your career in forensic anthropology, you think, has any lessons for the modern lay person who's just trying to navigate the internet, for example?
Yeah, there's a lot more that's available to us now than there ever was. And I at our freshers dinner at St. John's, I talked about what it was like for me as a fresher. And I had come from Inverness, which was a terribly sheltered background. And my first exposure as a fresher in Aberdeen University, I wasn't that far away from Inverness, they ran a film. And I was so shocked by the film. I can remember to this day how shocked I was by the film that they showed. And it was the Rocky Horror Picture Show, okay? I had never seen men in stockings and suspenders. It didn't happen in Inverness. So what was shocking to me back then is so mainstream now that there is no doubt we have a little bit of a desensitization, I think, happens. But the desensitization of what you see on a screen is very different to what you see when it's in front of you. And I don't think that ever goes away. So it used to be in the past, for forensic experts, they thought, you know, we're immune. There's never going to be anything we see that is going to affect us. And one of my dearest friends, Dick Shepherd, who's a forensic pathologist, wrote a book called Unnatural Causes. And Dick has done thousands of postmortems in his life. And one of the bravest men I know, he talked about being in a bar and he heard somebody drop ice cubes into a glass. And he suddenly realized he was back in Bali following the Bali bombings and all the rows of bodies that were laid out that families had to go along and try to find their loved one. And he said, I found myself going into a downward spiral and I couldn't get out of it. And he was suffering from post-traumatic stress. I have never known of any pathologist who has been brave enough to say, I'm just as susceptible to this as anybody else is. And we might think we're immune because we can see all these dreadful things on television. But when you're in the mortuary and you're faced with it, what you see, what you hear, what you smell, it's so strong, the smell, you can taste it. It never, ever leaves you. That's an assault on so many senses at the same time that you never, ever take that for granted. So you might see it, but the reality of it is something very, very different, very. And we have to try and train our students to be able to cope with that. And we do it very gradually. So if I can take them through a dissecting room, I can use the dissecting room to talk to them about death. I can talk to them about muscle and blood and bone. I can take them into a post-mortem in a hospital where it's not a violent environment. And we can start to get them more acclimatized towards it. But the first time I take them out on a case, I spend a lot of time talking to them about what it is that they're likely to see. I then talk about them to say, it's okay for this to be difficult, but you need to talk to us about it afterwards. So I have a wingman, and she knows me better than my husband does. And I've known my husband since I was 17. And she's my wingman, and she knows that if I start behaving differently, I drink more than I should, I'm not sleeping at night, she recognizes there's a problem, and I do the same for her. And you need to have that person you would trust your life with who's going to watch out for your well-being and your mental health. Because if I don't look out for mine and hers, we can't do our job, and we have to. So we really take what our students need to go through really seriously, because we don't want to break them. We really don't. They're going to be modern-day sin eaters who are going to consume the sins of the rest of the world, and we're going to have to help them learn how to cope with that. Because why would anybody ever want to do this for a living? It's ridiculous, utterly ridiculous. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Helen had a question, I think.
This is now where I'm worried, so lawyers and judges, yeah, are just
it was
so disrespectful.
It's a fair point. I know that you were talking about the Royal Society and the kind of guidance they've made for lawyers, but one of the things that I'm aware of is that lawyers are often very bad scientists or mathematicians, and people do get convicted, for example, in relation to sudden infant death, because lawyers don't understand statistics properly, so they misdirect juries in a way that they don't understand. And presumably the same is true of DNA evidence, that an expert who's sure of something could convince people without the lawyers necessarily understanding enough to unpack it. And I just wonder how, you talked about the irrelevant sort of snide question a poor lawyer will ask, but it is also a lawyer's job to make sure that all those questions have been asked and people can think about how much doubt there should be. How do you, I guess, train people to have to ask things and to have that appropriate and proper doubt?
Often in court, we will not have met the legal team before we're actually in the dock, and that's not helpful. So being able to be in a position where at least you can talk to the legal team, you can explore the extent of the evidence and the kind of questions you should be asking. But if the first time you meet them and you're standing in the box, there's What we will try to do is, of course, we can only answer the questions we're asked. And if we're not asked the right question, we can't give testimony. We actually can only answer the questions that we're asked. Sometimes we will get a lot of time with a legal team, and that's where it's most helpful. And certainly in an English court, you can sit in the courtroom, and so we can pass information to the legal teams that say, that's not quite true, you need to ask that question. In a Scottish courtroom, you can't do that. You're not allowed into the courtroom at any other time except to give your evidence, so you don't know what's going on around you. So we have to be able to operate, first of all, in all the jurisdictions within the UK, and they've all got slightly different legal systems. We might not be able to talk to them beforehand. All they have is your report to go on. So your report needs to be as informative as it possibly can be. But often where we get the most advice is when we'll sit down with tame lawyers like Donald Finlay to say, what kind of questions would you be asking me? And you know, Donald is wonderful for that, because if you can understand where he's likely to come from, then in your evidence you can say, well, I need to say this and this and this, because that may lead the legal team to ask the right sort of questions. Where we've tried to help is in the primers that are jointly from the Royal Society and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. They have come together to produce pieces of prose that are of simple language for people who are not scientists, and mainly it's the judges to be able to understand. So our job can't be to train every lawyer to be a scientist. That's not their job. But if the judge knows, when we're looking at a particular evidence type, this is the really solid ground of that evidence type, go for it, ask the questions there. But when you get onto here, do you know, the research isn't as strong. So if we're looking at DNA, being able to talk about statistics and probability, then it's fairly solid ground until you start to talk about transfer and persistence of DNA. So if you imagine you're in a bar, and it's a loud bar, to be heard, you'll shout. And as you shout, your DNA is being spread around you because it's being spread in your saliva. Your DNA is landing on all the people around you. They go home, and something happens at home, and there is a scene. Your DNA is now at that crime scene. You were never there, but your DNA is there. If we detect that DNA, and we can, because we can detect DNA from single cells, what does that mean? What does the evidence of your DNA at that crime scene mean? Unfortunately for you, if somewhere in your past you committed a crime, and you're on a DNA database, and we run it, we go, oh, you're a bad chap. You know, you've done a few naughty things in the past. Just so happens we've picked up your DNA here, but that person's never been there. We don't understand how DNA transfers, and we don't understand how long it persists on a piece of woolen jumper, or on a hoodie, or on whatever it may be. We just don't know. So that the lawyers need to understand how far the science can go, and beyond that step it's too far, because we don't have the research to be able to back it up. It's a very delicate scorpion dance that occurs in the courtroom around forensic science. And by and large, the jury are bored out of their mind in a courtroom. It's often not the most exciting place, I'm sure you'd agree, in the planet for a member of the public. And the last thing they want to hear is a statistician who comes in to talk about probability and Bayes' theorem, because at that point they've completely glazed over. But oh, a forensic scientist, they're sexy because I've seen them on CSI. And often all we do is disappoint, because we can't give the kind of expectation that they might have that television has given them. So we're often a big disappointment to the public.
I think there was a final question. Yes, there was a question there.
Is that working now? Yeah. Helen mentioned your work with vein patterns in hands, and I believe you've also got a citizen science project on that. I just wanted to ask about that, and also how you cope with that particular area of work.
So you've been doing your research. Thank you very much indeed. Delighted. So back in 2006, the Metropolitan Police got in touch with me to say we've got a case. And it's been rattling around inside our department. We don't know what the heck to do with it. And it was a young girl who alleged that her father came into her bedroom at night and sexually abused her. And she told her mother, and her mother refused to believe her. What the young girl did was she left her camera on her computer running at night. She put her camera on to record the abuse that she knew she was going to be subjected to. And at 4:30 in the morning, what we see is a hand and a forearm coming into view of her camera, doing exactly what she said was happening to her. If you leave your camera running at night, it flips into near infrared mode, and you can see in the dark. And near infrared light, when it goes onto human skin, it interacts with the deoxygenated blood in your vein. And you can see your vein patterns, like big black tram lines. So we had these tram line pattern of veins, superficial veins for the hands and the forearm that we could see. She took her video to the police and said, this is what my father is doing. So the police came to us and said, what can you do? And I have no idea. I'm a forensic anthropologist. I deal with dead bodies. I don't deal with vein patterns in child sexual abuse cases. And they said, but it's about anatomy. And I said, well, that's true. And in anatomy, we know that veins are variable. So I guarantee to you, and this is a dangerous thing to do in a room, but I guarantee to you that the pattern of veins on the back of your right hand are different to the pattern of veins on the back of your left hand. I guarantee if you're an identical twin, they will be completely different between you and your identical twin. They won't be the same as your mum or your dad or anybody else, because that vein pattern is laid down when you're a fetus inside your mum, and it's laid down in response to the sort of different tensions around you in that environment. So what I said is, from the times of Vesalius in the 1500s and before, we've known about variation. And there's no vein that has a firm name in the human hand below the level of the elbow, because everything beyond there is so utterly ridiculously variable that there's nothing constant. And I said, what I can guarantee is if we do a pattern of vein matching between the offender and the suspect, if they don't match, it's not him, because your veins don't change. You don't grow a new vein. What you've got is what you've got. But if they match, I don't know what that means, because we've not done the research. And the police said, no, that's okay, let's do it, because even if we could exclude Dad, that will help us in the case. And they matched perfectly between the veins on the perpetrator and the veins of suspect, which was Dad. And so the case went to the Crown Prosecution Service, and the Crown Prosecution Service said, no, we're going to take a punt, we're going to take this into court and see what happens, which is the worst thing that a scientist wants to hear. It's going to be had out in court. And the judge called a voir dire, so that the jury went away, and he decided on the basis of anatomical knowledge that he would allow the evidence to be heard. And it was the first time that evidence on vein pattern matching had been heard in a UK court. We gave our evidence, the jury went away, the jury came back and they found Dad not guilty. And at that point, you take the responsibility, and I said to our barrister, what did we do wrong? Were we not able to explain just how variable vein patterns can be? What did we do wrong? And the lawyer said to us, and I'll never forget it, she said, I don't think you did anything wrong. I think your evidence was fine. They didn't believe the girl. She didn't cry. She didn't break down. And in my mind, this was a young teenage girl who'd been brave enough to accuse her father, to record the abuse to show that it was happening, to take that evidence to the police and to go through a courtroom. And I thought, for a court to decide on the basis of they didn't believe her, then science needs to do the research. And that was what kicked off our research project. We needed to be able to go into courtroom the next time and say this is a 1 in a 500 chance, a 1 in 1,000, a 1 in a million chance. That's where the research needed to be. And very lucky for me at the time, I was training police officers. And so I had 500 police officers going through my department. And to a man and a woman, God bless them, they agreed to strip down to their underwear to allow me to photograph their hands and their forearms, their feet, their legs and their thighs, to look at vein pattern variation, to look at skin pattern variation, to be able to set the database and that was where we started the work. The citizen research project we've got going at the moment is we're training computers through AI to do our job. We want to be able to have the computers to say, in this video of child abuse, can we abstract the hands? If I abstract the hands, can I abstract the vein patterns? Can I abstract the knuckle crease pattern? So if you look at the pattern of skin creases over your knuckles, they're different on every finger and they're different across both your hands. If you're a redhead, you've got a freckle pattern, it's unique, it's yours. No one else is going to have your freckle pattern if you're a redhead. It's just not going to happen. I have 3 redhead children. None of their freckle patterns are the same. So all of these features that anatomy sees, we're training the computer to be able to find them. And my research team are so mean to me that they contacted me one day to say, we've just trained to do the computer to do something, and they found something you missed. No, absolutely not. That's never going to happen. I'm an expert. And that's exactly what they had. We have now got to a position where the computer is picking up a vein pattern that I had missed. And I think that's our way forward, is that we can now look through these millions of images using algorithms to abstract the patterns. And we can now connect cases that we've never been able to do in the past. So if you want to send us photographs of your hands, wonderful segue for me, thank you. If you look under H Unique, and you'll see it's through Lancaster University, and it's working jointly with Dundee University as well. So that H Unique project, we're asking the public, just photograph your hands. We strip off all the data, so it's not your data. We'll never be able to link it back to you. And it allows us to look at variation. That's where we create the algorithms. We then destroy the images, and it's the algorithms that we then use in the police databases to be able to say, this individual is a known child sex offender. Can we find their hand in the millions of images that are held by Interpol? And that's the way that our investigations are now going. Thank you for the question.
That's wonderful. Well, Sue, thank you so much indeed for sharing with us. Before we thank Sue, I would like to say, if you want to read more about this, her books, All That Matters and Written in Bone, absolutely beautifully written. They're sort of moving in places, hilarious in places, and inspiring throughout. They're absolutely wonderful. Before we close, Helen is going to just say a few words.
Yes. Well, I'm sure you'll all want to thank Sue. That was enthralling, and I think brought together a lot of questions about doubt and law and rights and bodies and science and AI, and it was wonderful. I suspect we may need to teach St George's a little bit more about psychology and teen psychology, but there we are. So I don't think it's your fault. But just before we thank Sue, I just want to let you know that next week's lecture, which is our Von Trott lecture, our annual Trott lecture in memory of Adam von Trott, who was an alumnus here and was hanged for trying to bring down Hitler. So we have an annual lecture in memory of him, and this year it's going to be Hartwig Fischer, who's the director of the British Museum, talking about deep history and the world of Stonehenge, and a completely different kind of detective work. So do come along or tell people who might be interested, and that's at 5:30 next week. But yes, thank you very much, Sue. Steve and I can thank you together.